Hi there, welcome to Premium Builds, I'm John. In this video we've rounded up a number of popular boards on the AMD B550 chipset. We've got a couple of boards from the lower end, a couple of mid-range boards and a couple of higher range boards as well, and we'll look at the differences in features and if there's any difference in performance so that you can make the right choice for your PC. We can then use this information to make some recommendations about the best boards for your next PC build. We'll break this information out into a separate video so as not to clutter this one up and make it too long. We've got 6 boards on test here. At the lower end we've got the MSI PRO-VDH Wi-Fi. This is an M80X board with a good feature set and an attractive price point. We've also got the GIGABYTE AORUS Elite, which is again an entry-level B550 motherboard, but it's got attractive looks, and we'll have a look at the feature set and see if it's a worthy option. In the mid-range we're looking at the ASUS TUF Gaming B550 Plus Wi-Fi. A bit of a mouthful, but what's it like to actually use? Is it a decent board? It's got a good feature set and great looks, but does it stand up to the testing that we're going to put it through? We've also got the MSI B550 MORTAR Wi-Fi, which is a board we know quite well. We've used it in our test rig for about 6 months now, and it's a good performer, but we wanted to test it against the other options and see whether it's a viable option for you, whether it represents good value. And for the higher end, we've got the ASUS ROG STRIX B550F Wi-Fi, which is a very strong board with a good feature set, great VRMs, and Wi-Fi inbuilt. So we wanted to see whether it was worth the money, because this is a board that retails at around $200, nearly twice as much as the cheapest board we've got in this test. Also at this test at the higher end, we've got the ASROCK PG Velocita B550, which is aimed at the higher end of the market and enthusiasts as well, with some kind of overclocking aimed features, like a strong VRM and inbuilt power and reset buttons, along with boot code display. It's also great looking. Does that justify the price tag, and is it missing anything we'd consider essential? Before we dive into the review, let's look at some of the important points you want to consider while you're choosing a motherboard. Firstly, is B550 the right chipset for you? The B550 chipset is fully featured. It enables PCIe 4.0 on the primary GPU slot and the primary M.2 slot. The main difference between this and the X570 motherboard, which is the higher end one, is that the X570 has a PCIe 4.0 link to the chipset, which therefore allows PCIe 4.0 devices to come off the chipset as well. So you can have 2 PCIe 4.0 primary GPUs or M.2 drives. With pricing starting at around $100, the B550 is an attractive option. You get a really high performance board, there's no difference in performance, it allows overclocking of both CPU and RAM, just as X570 does. There's really not a lot of reason to step up to the X570 board unless you're buying a high-end CPU like the 5900X or 5950X, and you're going to be doing productivity work, work that demands that more flexible chipset. For almost all users, the B550 is going to be the right choice. It does absolutely everything you need, it won't hinder the performance of your other components at all, and it offers good value with the motherboards we're looking at here. We're focusing this review in on the great value Ryzen CPUs you're most likely going to want to pair with these motherboards. They're the Ryzen 5600X with 6 cores and the Ryzen 5800X with 8 cores. We've done all of our testing with the Ryzen 5800X in the knowledge that as long as it doesn't throttle performance on that CPU, then a 5600X will also perform to full potential on any of these boards. Before we start looking at the individual boards, let's just take an overview of the performance of them. To check this, we've run a number of CPU intensive tasks on each of these boards using the same CPU and configuration of the system. We ran Cinebench R20 and R23 benchmark tests on both single and multi-core workloads. We also ran 3D Mark's gaming tests of the TimeSpy and Firestrike CPU tests to see if we could find any difference in performance. We ran these tests both as one-offs and also on a loop to ensure that the CPUs weren't going to throttle after several minutes of full load use. The main aim of these tests is to find out if the motherboard's power delivery is up to powering a Ryzen 5800X, the CPU under test, for long periods without limiting performance through throttling. This test isn't necessarily particularly representative of gaming, which generally places a lesser load on a CPU. There are very few games that place full all-core loads on CPUs for prolonged periods of time. What's more important there is boost clock. So we just ran some metrics there as well, just to ensure that each of these boards allowed peak boost clock to be achieved on our CPU. We ran these tests with RAM set to 3600 MHz CL16 with Infinity Fabric and the memory controller clock running at 1:1 ratio, so 1800 MHz. The long story short here is that there was no discernible performance difference between any of the boards under test here. Absolutely all of them provided near identical scores, certainly within a margin of error, on any test we ran. In fact, if we normalise the scores across the tests and then average them out for each board, we can find that the total variance board to board is less than 0.2%. There's basically no difference between them, and margins of error in testing are far greater than any difference that these boards impose on a Ryzen 5800X. For that reason, we're happy to recommend you run a 5800X or a 5600X on any of the boards in this test. You'll get full performance and it won't limit your system at all using them. We also did a bit of testing with RAM, although it's not possible to test this exhaustively, obviously just because of the number of RAM kits on the market and various different timings. However, all of these boards ran absolutely flawlessly with our G-Skill 3600 MHz CL16 RAM kit. We just set XMP. Infinity clock and U clock were set 1-to-1 automatically by the board's BIOSes, and they ran flawlessly throughout our testing. We also used a Samsung B-Die kit, which is rated at 4400 MHz CL19. However, we've got some known stable settings, which are 4000 MHz CL16, 16, 1632, and some subtimings adjusted as well that we know are stable, having tested them quite exhaustively. And we tested those on each of our boards and found that it was able to run them stably across the board with no difference. Whilst we wouldn't necessarily recommend any of these boards particularly for RAM overclocking, they're all capable of running sensible RAM kits at rated speeds and above. They all permit memory overclocking, so that's something you can dig into if you want to. So the happy conclusion with performance then is that there's no discernible difference with any of these boards in sort of normal usage scenarios. You can choose any of them and be sure you'll get the most out of the components you pair them with. If you are looking at other boards though, we'd just recommend you avoid the very cheapest on the market. There are some without VRM heatsinks and with cost-cutting measures like there's only one M.2 slot or something like that. So just take a quick look at specs when you are comparing cheaper boards and make sure that you're not losing important functionality or getting a cut price board that maybe won't perform like the ones in this test do. So with that covered, let's take a look at each of these boards in turn. I'm not going to list the specifications for them because they're actually quite similar, the core specs, and you can look them up yourselves if it's a board you're interested in buying. What I'll do instead is draw your attention to the pros and cons of each board and give you a conclusion as to how we feel it sits in terms of value and features. We hope that by the end of this video, if there's a board in it that you're considering buying, you'll have a good idea of its features and whether it's right for you, and also if there's anything you need to take into consideration when planning your build. So first up, let's take a look at the MSI PRO-VDH Wi-Fi. This is a good value board, it's M80X, and it's retailing at around $110 at the moment on Amazon. This is a fairly full-featured board, and overall we were really impressed with it. First up, its performance matched any other board in the test with no problems running a Ryzen 5800X, and secondly, it does have a good range of features. There's adequate fan headers, it's got 5 in total, 3 for the system, 1 for the CPU and 1 for an AIO pump. It's got some good RGB connectivity options, but no RGB on the board itself. What is useful is that it does actually have a small switch which can be used to disable the RGB if that's not something you want in a more professional or office-based build. On the rear panel you can see it's got inbuilt Wi-Fi and also a very simple to use flashback switch. We actually updated the BIOS on this board to run a 5000 series CPU, and it was very simple to use, took about 5 minutes to update the BIOS and get the board working. And you can do that without a compatible CPU, which is the important feature there. It's also got an internal USB-C header, which doesn't appear on some boards, and it's something, if your case has a USB-C front port, you'll want to look for this USB 3.2 Gen 2 header on the board. And finally at the rear I/O, you can see there's a good range of options here. It's got 6 USB sockets in total, which is perhaps a little lower than some, but it doesn't have a USB-C on the rear of the I/O panel. You'll need to connect that via the internal header if that's something you want, and you'll need to get a case with that functionality built in. The downsides of this board aren't super important, but there are some things you might want to bear in mind if you are looking to buy it. First of all, it only has one full-length PCIe X16 slot. That's obviously for a GPU primarily, but you might find if you want to add in something like a capture card or an X4 card, you've only got 2 1X slots here, so you need to plan your other additional cards fairly carefully on this motherboard. It's also got quite a basic audio chip. It's just an ALC892 audio chip and output. It's fine for basic use and for gaming, but if you want to do more complex audio things or you're looking for a little bit more sound quality out of your motherboard itself, you might want to look at a board with something a little better like the ALC1220. The other downsides really are just the lack of that USB-C socket on the rear, and the fact that it's an M80X board. That just means if you're buying an 80X case, a standard size case, you'll have a gap running along the bottom here, which you might consider looks ugly. There's also just the fairly flat aesthetic of this board. It's fairly no frills. They do actually do the MSI Bazooka, which is exactly the same functionality of this board, but just with a slightly more gamery aesthetic, and it's another $10. So if you want something that looks a little bit more gamer-centric, you can always pay a little bit extra to get the looks you like. Overall, in conclusion though, we were really impressed with this board. It's got a great feature set, it doesn't lack anything. MSI have been very sensible in what they've included and what they've omitted in order to keep costs down and value high. There's basically nothing this board doesn't do that you would expect it to. If you are looking to choose this board, we'd really just advise that you make sure that you're going to be satisfied with just one full-length PCIe slot, and secondly that the USB configuration at the rear panel isn't going to cause you any issues if you've got a large number of USB devices to plug in. It may well be that you choose to use a USB hub anyway to alleviate that. Overall though, this is an understated but great value option, and we can heartily recommend the MSI PRO-VDH Wi-Fi as a great board for gaming or general use. Moving on then, we've got the GIGABYTE B550M AORUS Elite. It's another M80X board, and it's the most affordable we've got under test here. It's currently retailing at about $105. The pros for this board, I think, are first of all its branding. It looks quite neat, it's got some nice branding on the heat sinks, and it's obviously great value at $105 as well. It also performed identically to the more expensive boards in our testing here, so it's not going to cost you any performance with a Ryzen 5600X or 5800X. It's also got BIOS Q Flash, which is activated by a switch just down here, which again means you can update the BIOS without a compatible CPU installed, and that's an important feature on AMD boards. If we take a look at the rear I/O shield, you can see that it's inbuilt, which just helps when you're building the PC, keeps things neat and tidy, and there's actually 8 USB sockets here on the rear as well, but no USB-C, so bear that in mind if you do need USB-C for anything. The PCIe slot configuration on this board is quite interesting. It does have 2 full-length PCIe X16 slots, but they're only 2 slots apart. This means that if you've got a GPU that's even only slightly over 2 slots, like 2.2 slots, some of them are now, it will impede this bottom slot. You're probably going to struggle to fit a card into this bottom slot. Obviously there's no Wi-Fi on this board, so you'll want to make sure, if you are going to fit a Wi-Fi PCIe card, which is the best kind to get, that your GPU allows you to do that. For the negatives of this board, there are a few that relate to the cost cutting and the value point of the board. There's things like there's no heat sinking on either of the M.2 slots, which isn't a great deal, but might just not fit with the aesthetic you're looking for. These 4 SATA ports where you connect SATA SSDs or hard disks are awkwardly located, and if you've got a large GPU, you may find it actually impinges on these and makes it difficult to use some or all of these slots. In terms of USB, there's no internal USB 3.2 Gen 2 header, and there's no USB-C on the rear as well, which means that this board you're going to struggle to make a USB-C connection to it if you need that for anything. There's also no diagnostic LEDs on this board. That means that when you're booting, you won't get an indicative LED if you've got a problem with CPU, RAM, GPU. Most boards do have that, and it's something that can be very useful on first setup. And it's omitted on this board, which means if it doesn't boot first time, you could be left struggling a little bit trying to diagnose the problem. There's also a slight shortage of fan headers on this board. There's one at the rear here, there's one at the top for the CPU, and there's a system one located down at the bottom here as well. All in all, just 3 fan headers means that you may well end up needing a fan splitter if you've got more than just 2 system fans, and that can add a little bit to the cost or increase the complexity of the build a little bit. Another couple of fan headers or an AIO pump header on this board would really have helped round that specification out and get you the fan headers you'd need. Overall then, the GIGABYTE B550M AORUS Elite is a good value board, but it just misses out on some features that we'd really expect at the price point, and that you do get on the MSI PRO-VDH for just $5 more. It's really the price cutting on this board, with the lack of boot diagnostic LEDs, the awkward SATA socket placement, the lack of fan headers, and the slightly awkward PCIe slot arrangement, that mean that it's perhaps not the best value. In all but the most basic PC builds, we think this board's actually going to frustrate you a little bit just through lack of those features. At the right price, this is still a good motherboard. It certainly doesn't cost you any performance, but we'd consider a sensible price to pay for this board perhaps to be around $90, and it is worth spending a little bit more than the price of this board because it does get you a lot more in quality of life features that are going to help you both when you're building and using the PC. Moving on to our next board, let's take a look at the ASUS TUF Gaming B550 M Plus Wi-Fi. It's a bit of a mouthful, and I'm not even sure if it's TUF or TUF, so I'll use them interchangeably and hope nobody notices. The ASUS TUF branding has offered some really good value products. At the minute, this board's retailing at around $160, which I'd say is a little bit pricey, but let's take a look at the features and specifications and see if it's worth that money. On the plus side, this board I think is great looking. It's got really nice aesthetic with the heat sinking around the top of the VRM and also on this lower M.2 slot here. It's also got some really nice RGB highlights that run through the board here, although a GPU will obscure them in a lot of builds. On the rear panel, you can see that there's Wi-Fi included in this board. It's Wi-Fi 6. There's also ASUS's BIOS flashback button, which allows you to update the BIOS without a compatible CPU installed. And we've got a really good range of USB ports here with 8 ports in total, and one of them is USB-C. There's also a full-featured audio output panel, which goes with the high-quality Realtek S1200 audio codec included on this motherboard. There's also a very strong VRM. It's a VRM that would happily say can run the Ryzen 5900X, for example, and this board performed equivalently to any other board in this test. The downsides of this board then are really limited to the slightly awkward SATA port positioning. There's no internal USB 3.2 Gen 2 header, so if you've got a case with a USB-C front socket, you may find it won't connect to this board and it wouldn't be active, so bear that in mind. There's also the slightly awkward PCIe slot positioning. Again, these two full-length slots are just 2 slots apart. If you get a larger GPU, it will obscure the bottom slot. However, the 1X slot is mounted above the primary GPU slot in this board, which is nice to keep it open regardless of the size of GPU you fit. There is also a slight lack of fan headers on this motherboard. There are just 2 system fan headers, 1 CPU fan header, and then 1 optional or AIO pump header. So bear that in mind, you might need some splitters to power all the fans in your system, depending on how many you're going to fit. In conclusion though, we really like this motherboard. It's fun to build with, it's got some really nice features, and it's a good performer as well. Unfortunately, the main problem with it at the moment is its price. It's retailing at around $160, and that just feels a little bit expensive for the feature set on offer. $140 to $150 is perhaps more reasonable. It performs well and looks great, so as long as you find it at the right price, it's a good board to buy. Just make sure that those slight missing features don't impede the build that you're planning. Moving on then, the other mid-range board we've got in our test is the MSI B550M MORTAR Wi-Fi. As you can see, it's the board we use in our test bench and the board we've had most experience with, but it's been really interesting to test it against the other options and see how it stacks up. The plus points of this board are that it does have the USB 3.2 Gen 2 internal header, as well as USB-C on the rear I/O panel. It's got plenty of fan headers. There are 3 system fan headers, 1 CPU fan header and 1 AIO pump header, which makes for ample for most mid-range builds. It's got 2 full-length PCIe slots, and they're mounted 3 slots apart, which means you can actually fit 2 normal-sized GPUs in this motherboard, or other large expansion cards. It also possesses BIOS flashback, like all MSI boards, allowing you to update BIOS without the compatible CPU fitted. There's a built-in I/O shield, which helps with the build process, and it does also have inbuilt Wi-Fi. There's also a non-Wi-Fi option, although that has slightly different aesthetic without the silver heatsinks, but it will save you a little bit of money if you know that you don't need Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. It also has 6 SATA slots, where many MTX boards only have 4. So the downsides for this board really are at the moment are its price. It's retailing around $170, which is pretty expensive, and it does only have 5 USB-A sockets on the rear panel, although it also has a USB-C. That's a little bit limited, and you might just want to factor it into your build plans. Make sure you've got adequate USB expansion. And finally, there's just the fact that it's an M-ATX board, so whilst it's a good board, you might find that it doesn't fit the aesthetic if you put it into a ATX case. There'll be that gap at the bottom of the motherboard if that bothers you. In conclusion then, this is a board that gets a lot of things right. It's got a good range of internal expansion and connectors. It's well laid out and well thought out. The main downside really is the slight lack of USB on the rear with just those 5 sockets. Subjectively, the silver aesthetic of this board matches white or silver themed builds really well, and it can look really good when it's built up into the right system with some white and silver highlights. It's a little bit subjective as well, but we find the MSI BIOS one of the slightly easier to get along with. It's well organised in there and it's easy to get in and tweak settings. Some of the other BIOSes we found feel a little bit jumbled and confused in comparison. And as I said, if you want to save a bit more money, there is a non-Wi-Fi version available at $155. Overall then, this is a great board and we heartily recommend it. Just be a little bit cautious on pricing. Don't overpay for this motherboard. If you see it at around $150, we think it represents great value and you should snap it up. Moving up then to the higher end of B550 motherboards, we've got the ASUS ROG STRIX B550F Gaming Wi-Fi. We're calling this the higher end because it's $200, and whilst there are more expensive motherboards than B550 chipset, we'd consider that really once you're past $200, you probably want to be looking to the X570 chipset and get the extra functionality that that chipset can offer. At $200, we're really reaching the kind of upper limit of value for the B550 motherboard, considering they're best paired with the good value offerings of the Ryzen 5600X and 5800X now that it's had a price cut. The plus points for this motherboard are that it's full ATX, it's got a good range of PCIe slots with 2 full-length slots and 3 PCI 1X slots, and they're well spaced so you'll have no trouble fitting in additional expansion cards. There's also some great looking heat sinking with that RGB built in and the ROG STRIX branding. It's got a good range of fan connection options. There's 6 fan headers in total. There's CPU fan, AIO pump fan, and then chassis fan headers as well. So you're going to have no problems fitting a good range of cooling options to this motherboard. It uses the high-end S1220 audio codec, so you've got good high-quality sound output from this motherboard. And of course it has BIOS flashback, like other ASUS boards as well. This is a great option so that you can update the BIOS without a compatible CPU and get your build up and running as quickly as possible with minimal fuss. It also has 6 SATA slots. The negatives of this board really are that it still does only have 2 M.2 slots, and that there's no internal USB 3.2 Gen 2 header, and that's a fairly glaring admission I think on a high-end board. That's something you would expect but don't get with this motherboard. And finally then there's just the question of value. At $200 this motherboard feels expensive considering you don't get a great deal of additional functionality. There's better value in some slightly cheaper ATX options, or even in the M-ATX options we've looked at in this video. They've got basically the same functionality and performance, but they save you quite a bit of money. In conclusion then, there's a lot to like about this motherboard, not least the looks. However, we do think that you're paying quite a lot for the ROG STRIX branding, especially when you consider the raw feature set. You're not getting a great deal extra for your money. Remember, you're not buying any more performance. The 5600X and 5800X perform exactly the same on this motherboard as on boards that cost half as much. Overall, if you like the looks and features and don't mind paying a bit of a ROG STRIX tax, then this is a great motherboard and a good choice. However, we'd suggest that you consider either saving money and going for a board that has all the same features, slightly lower price, or perhaps if you're willing to spend this much, looking at options in the X570 range that do actually get you a little bit of extra feature and functionality for your money. Finally, let's move on to the most expensive motherboard that we've got in this test. This is the ASROCK PG Velocita. It's an overclocking aimed motherboard. It's marketed at enthusiasts, and whilst it has retailed at around $250, $260, it's been discounted to more like $200 recently. So we wanted to find out if it offered good value at that price point. The pros of this board then are that it's obviously full ATX format, it's a full-sized motherboard, and you can see it's got a good range of PCIe slots, 2 full-length slots, 2 1X slots, and they're all sensibly spaced for fitting multiple GPUs or larger expansion cards. It's also got a number of features aimed at overclockers. You can see here it's got power and reset buttons inbuilt. There's a boot diagnostic code LED display here that gives codes rather than simple lights to indicate faults or errors when you're trying to boot the board. It's also got a really overkill VRM with 14 phases. It'll happily run a Ryzen 5950X. It's got plenty of power supply for that. And there's also an inbuilt heat pipe in here just to help spread the heat load between the VRMs and get heat out to the heat sinking here. It's got 2 M.2 slots, some really nice inbuilt RGB as well. In terms of cooling options, it's got 7 fan headers total. So obviously it's aimed at flexible cooling solutions if you are looking to overclock. There's good connectivity on the rear I/O. It doesn't have Wi-Fi inbuilt in this board, but it does actually have the sockets ready placed for them should you put in an add-in card. And there's an M.2 slot as well, so you can add in a small M.2 Wi-Fi card and not take up a PCIe slot. There's good USB connectivity with 7 USB-A ports and 1 USB-C on the rear panel. There's also a USB 3.2 Gen 2 header on the inside of the board there. Talking about the feature set of this board is quite interesting because there's some features here that we've actually got quite mixed feelings about. For example, it has power and reset buttons, which are fine and were useful for me testing it on a test bench. But we question the value of them really when you're going to build this into a normal case, use the case's power and reset buttons. Whilst it has the aesthetic of an overclocking board, it's not really a board we would choose to use to overclock a Ryzen CPU. The same goes for this boot fault code display. It could be really useful, but the codes that it gives you in the index, in the manuals and online, are so cryptic that it's actually no more useful than simply having a light to tell you there's a problem with CPU or RAM and troubleshooting from there. ASROCK could really help you out by giving more descriptive fault codes and explaining in a troubleshooting guide how you could actually address them. We're also slightly mixed about the aesthetic. I happen to really like the aesthetic and the inbuilt RGB on this board. I think it looks good and you could build it into an interesting looking system. However, it's a bit love it or hate it with the red flashes as well, and we're not sure everybody will really get on with the way this board looks, and that's an important consideration when you're spending a lot on a motherboard. In terms of the downsides of this motherboard, there's one glaring omission that really makes it quite hard to recommend, and that's the fact that there's no BIOS flashback option on this board. There's no way to update the BIOS unless you have a compatible CPU, and in fact it's the only board in the test here that forced us to go back and refit a Ryzen 3600, a compatible CPU, and use that to actually update the BIOS on the board so that it would run the Ryzen 5000 series. This board wasn't bought that long ago, it was only bought about 3 months ago. And therefore we'd have to caution you that if you do choose an ASROCK motherboard, as to our knowledge none of them have BIOS flashback features on the B550s, therefore you will have to have some plan in place for how you're going to get that bootable BIOS onto your motherboard in order to run a Ryzen 5000 CPU. So do bear that in mind. It's a big omission for this board, particularly when it's aimed at the enthusiast market. It's something we'd expect. It's something much cheaper boards have managed to incorporate, and we don't understand why it's missing as a feature on this motherboard. Do beware as well, whilst it has 3 M.2 slots, one of them is actually E-key and is designed only for a Wi-Fi card, so you can't fit 3 SSDs to this motherboard. It's the same as everything else under this test. Only 2 M.2 slots are suitable for storage. And finally, it's just the price as well is the downside of this board. We didn't pay $250 for this, we paid €200, which is an acceptable price, I would say, for a board with this feature set. There is value in there. The VRM is very high quality. You don't necessarily need it. The problem with that is it's kind of overkill for Ryzen because they run very well on limited power, and you don't need the heavy overkill VRMs that you'd need for a high-end overclocking Intel system, for example. That said, it's there, it'll run cool, it'll run efficiently, and that's where a lot of the value is in this motherboard. In conclusion then, this motherboard is the one that sparked most mixed feelings from us in this review. We really want to love it. It's got on paper a great feature set, it's got some interesting looks, it's got nice RGB. We just question some of the decisions the design team have made when they've been laying out this board. They've included some features like the power buttons and the LED that probably sell the board, but they're not actually that useful to you when you're using it. Meanwhile, they've omitted a key feature, that BIOS flashback feature, that we consider essential for any AMD motherboard, just because there's a good chance you're going to need at some point to flash a BIOS onto the motherboard when you don't have a compatible CPU. Also, the overclocking features of this motherboard really feel like they've been added more for marketing purposes than actual utility. That goes for the overkill VRM, the power and reset switches, and that kind of somewhat useless boot code diagnostic display that doesn't really help you all that much. They've been added because they look cool, not because they're useful feators. If you're aware of the shortcomings of this board, you've got a plan to get around that BIOS issue, then we'll heartily recommend it at the right price. Don't pay more than around $200 for this board. Once you're up towards $250 or so, you're much better off looking towards X570 motherboards and gaining the additional features of that chipset. Otherwise, in a straight fight, we'd recommend the ASUS B550F Wi-Fi just because of that extra feature, the Wi-Fi that's much more useful than the overclocking oriented features on this motherboard. So that concludes this video. We really hope you found it useful and that if you're considering any of these motherboards, you've now got the information you need to help you make up your mind on them. The nice thing with B550 motherboards is that throughout our testing, we really haven't found any that are ones to avoid. Once you're past that sort of $100 price point, you've got a little bit of heat sinking on the VRMs. We found that they perform equally, they've got the same basic feature set, and it really is just about deep diving those little things like the number of fan headers, PCIe slot locations, and USB connectivity that'll help you make up your mind. We'd just caution if you do end up choosing an ASROCK board that you have some plan of how to install a BIOS on it to get the PC up and running. We hope you found this video useful. Please do check out our companion video. We're going to run through motherboards that we haven't included in this test, but using the information we've got from this testing to inform you as to some of the best options in entry-level, mid-range and higher-end B550 motherboards. Please do also check out premiumbuilds.com. We've got a host of guides and information there to really make sure that your next PC is as good as it can be. Check us out at premiumbuilds.com.